In Galatians 3:13, Paul says that Christ became a curse for us. But what in the world does that mean? It might not mean what you think it means. You see, you might think that this verse has something to do with Jesus being cursed by God in our place at the cross, or something along those lines. But there are some difficulties with this passage that make it not so obvious. Let's start by just reading a modern English translation, which says, Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law by becoming a curse for us, for it is written, Cursed is everyone who is hanged on a tree. So the first thing we should recognize here is that Paul is citing an Old Testament passage when he says, for it is written. So to get to the bottom of Galatians 3:13, we need to first go back and look at the verse that is being cited. This is a reference to Deuteronomy 21:22 through 23, which says, And if a man has committed a crime punishable by death, and he is put to death, and you hang him on a tree, his body shall not remain all night on the tree, but you shall bury him the same day. For a hanged man is cursed by God. You shall not defile your land that the Lord your God is giving you for an inheritance. So you might be tempted to think that Paul's logic here is that, hey, this Old Testament passage says every man hung on a tree is cursed by God. Jesus hung on a tree, so Jesus is cursed by God. And that is what it means for Christ to become a curse for us. But that might be a mistake, and here's why. Unfortunately, the English text does not fully convey some of the nuances and issues that are in the Hebrew. In fact, the ESV, which I just read from, makes some interpretive decisions which influence the meaning of the text. You see, one of the main difficulties here is that the Hebrew formulation of the phrase that gets translated into cursed by God, the Hebrew here, translated literally, would be that the man is a curse of God. As Michael Grassanti notes in his commentary, scholars have debated whether this genitival construction should be regarded as an objective genitive, a curse to God, or a subjective genitive, cursed by God. Fox renders the phrase an insult to God, and Phillips offers a repudiation of God. Jeffrey Tigay, in his commentary, translates this passage as saying that the impaled body is an affront to God, and says this clause has occasioned considerable speculation because the meaning and syntax of the final phrase are ambiguous. The present translation reflects a rabbinic explanation that the criminal's body may not be maltreated, since that would be an offense against God in whose image even the criminal was created. This translation is maintained by some early Jewish commentators, and I think that this translation makes sense for both Deuteronomy and for the passage in Galatians. So let's first render the verse using the cursed by God interpretation that's in many English translations and see how the logic flows. So this starts with the command, right? God says, hey, if you put someone to death and hang up their body, don't leave it up overnight. Then we get this kind of connecting word for, which seems to imply that what is going to come next is an explanation or reason for what was just said. And then we get the statement that the hangman is cursed by God. This logic doesn't seem to flow well. What does a man being cursed by God have to do with the command that came before it to not leave his body up? This just seems to kind of be a weird statement about this guy, right? Then we get the next phrase about not defiling the land. What does this phrase have to do with the preceding statements? Why would leaving the man cursed by God hanging, why would that have something to do with defiling the land? You might want to say, well, because he was cursed by God. But why would the mere fact that he was cursed by God mean that leaving him up all night would defile the land? Why would God have an issue with that? I'm not saying this reading can't work, or it's so difficult that it can't be maintained. I'm just noting that there's some jarring aspects of this reading. We get a command, and then a seemingly unrelated statement about God just like thinking this guy is cursed, and then another command, and they're just kind of disjointed. There seems to be lacking a clear line of continuity. Let's now compare this to the alternative reading, which is that this person is an affront to God. I will here use the translation offered by Jeffrey Tigay in his commentary. In this rendering, we have the command, that's the same. We have the connecting for, but then what comes next is an explanation for the command. The idea is that God doesn't want you to leave up the body overnight because that man hanging on the cross overnight, that's an insult to him. It's dishonoring to God for you to do that. This seems like a much clearer explanation. The reason that this is an insult to God is potentially because the man is made in God's image, and it's an affront to God to see his image rotting and being eaten by, bugs and animals out in the open like that overnight. Then we get the statement not to defile the land. This statement about not defiling the land seems to make more sense on this reading. God says, don't do this act. It's an insult to me. And the implication is that by leaving up this insult to God, you will defy the very land by having this grotesque, decomposing image of God God in the land. The very image of God being treated like that, that is the thing that defiles it. So if we just look at Deuteronomy 21:22 through 23, there's a strong argument to be made that the best reading is that the man hung on the tree is not a person who has been cursed by God, but rather is a curse to God. To curse another person in the ancient world can mean to insult them, dishonor them. So how would this interpretation work in Galatians 3:13? Under this view, when Paul says that Jesus became a curse, he is saying that Christ became something that is offensive to God. Christ became something that was in fact an affront to the Father. Doesn't this make sense? Christ is the eternal Son, the firstborn of creation, greatly loved by the Father, and he is hanging on the tree. He's naked, he's beat, he's whipped, he's mocked, he's crying out. Isn't that something that God would take as an insult to himself? Isn't that something that would be an affront to God? So the idea here is that Christ became something that was offensive to God in order to free us from this curse of the law. But here's the thing, as much as I would love for it to be that easy, it's unfortunately not. There are some strong objections that can be raised against the idea that I just presented. So let me turn to those now. The first obstacle is that the Septuagint translates this passage as cursed by God. The Septuagint is a Greek translation of the Old Testament that was in widespread use during the time of the apostles, and it's associated with 70 translators. That 70 translators is going to be important for a later quote that we see later. You see, the Septuagint removes the ambiguity from the Hebrew when it says that the person is cursed by God. And what's worse for the view that I just articulated is that Paul, when quoting this passage in Galatians 3:13, he seems to quote from the Septuagint version and says that everyone who is hanged on a tree is cursed. So some people think that this version of the Septuagint and Paul's use of it clearly cuts against the reading that I'm advocating. For instance, Grisanti says most translations and scholars correctly translate it as a subjective genitive, supported by the Septuagint and Galatians 3:13. Yahweh commands the Israelites to hang a criminal's body on a tree as an expression of that person's accursed state, i.e., to provide tangible evidence that this criminal is the object of curse. So how might I respond to this? Well, for this, I'm going to draw on a great paper by Ardell Cainday. This is available for free online, so I highly recommend you check it out if you find this interesting. But before I talk about Cainday, I do want to add something in here. Notice an error in that quote from Grisanti's commentary that I just read. The text doesn't have God commanding the Israelites to do this. This is not something that's being initiated by Yahweh. This is God saying, when you do this, and then he's setting a limitation on it. He's saying, when you do this, here is the boundary for how long you can set up. There's nothing in this verse to indicate that God is commanding the Israelites to do this or that God wants the Israelites to do this. I just want to make that comment, and then I'll go on to Cainday. Cainday notes, in accordance with other scholars, that when Paul cites this verse, he doesn't cite it precisely as it is represented in the Greek Septuagint or the Masoretic text. So when Paul cites this, the exact wording he uses doesn't correspond to the Greek Septuagint that I just mentioned, but it also isn't a strict, precise reading of the Hebrew. So what's going on here? Paul omits the words by God that are in the Greek Septuagint. Cainday notes that scholars frequently regard Paul's omission of by God after cursed as his attempt to avoid suggesting that Christ on the cross was really cursed by God. Paul leaves the curse unqualified, for his point is that Christ became on our behalf a curse, absolutely. So he makes no reference to God in either his assertion or the quotation itself. Cainday then goes on to note that while the Septuagint supports cursed of God, other sources are not quite so clear. Symmachus seems to try and clear up the issue by saying that the man was hanged for blasphemy of God. Targum Pseudo-Jonathan renders this verse as, because it is a disgrace before God to impale someone unless his sins were the cause of it. Others, such as Aquila and Theodotion, reproduce the ambiguity of the Hebrew and merely say curse of God. It seems to me that these differences arise because the text is ambiguous and they are trying to make things clearer. And the reading of the Septuagint is an important piece of the textual puzzle, but so are these other versions and these other quotes that I mentioned. Now, the difficulty of this text is not something missed by early Christians. For instance, the Christian writer Jerome has some very interesting remarks about this passage in his commentary on the Galatians. Jerome lists numerous different ways that this passage of Deuteronomy has been interpreted, going through some of those people that I just mentioned, and then he says this: the reason we have compiled these things is because of a very well-known problem. In order to slander us, the Jews customarily raised the objection that our Lord and Savior was under God's curse. Jerome then goes on to argue that surely it's not the case that any person who is hanged on a tree is thus cursed, for if some righteous martyr was hanged on a cross for their, maybe perseverance in the Jewish faith, that person would not be considered cursed but a saint. And Jerome argues that clearly one is accursed if they commit a crime worthy of the gallows, not one who was crucified by the wickedness of their judges. Now, Jerome then continues and goes back to the issue of Paul's citation and says, I cannot determine why the apostle has either subtracted or added something in respect to what is written, cursed by God is everyone who hangs on a tree. For if he once and for all followed the authority of the 70 translators, he should have attached the name of God, just as they published it. But if, as a Hebrew of Hebrews, he supposed that what he had read in his own language was the truest, he should not have adopted the words all or on a tree, which are not found in the Hebrew. Therefore, it appears to me that either the ancient Hebrew books read differently than they do now, or that the apostle, as I have already said previously, recorded the sense, not the words, of the scriptures. Or we must instead suppose that after the passion of Christ, both in the Hebrew manuscripts and in our own, the name of God was added by someone in order to introduce grounds for slandering us, who believe in a Christ who was cursed by God. And so I proceed to this contest with a reckless pace. I appeal to the manuscripts that in no passage is it written that anyone was cursed by God, and wherever the word curse is recorded, the name of God is never added. Now, Jerome then goes on to list a bunch of instances in the Bible where curses are mentioned, Adam, Cain, Canaan, so on and so forth. And then he continues that we should not be disturbed that Christ became a curse for us. And what's interesting is that Justin Martyr, in his dialogue with Trypho, chapter 96, also seems to reject the idea that Christ was cursed by God. Justin wants to shy away from that. Now, additionally, the word that Paul uses for cursed in Galatians 3:13 is also different from the word that's used in the Greek Septuagint. The Septuagint uses the perfect participle, whereas the quote from Paul uses the adjective. Now, this form that Paul cites, while not corresponding to the Septuagint of Deuteronomy 21:23, does correspond to cursed in the Septuagint reading of Deuteronomy 27:26, which says, cursed be anyone who does not confirm the words of this law by doing them. Now, Paul cites Deuteronomy 27:26 in verse 10 of Galatians 3. So by using this word for curse, one might reasonably infer that Paul is trying to connect the cursed of Deuteronomy 27:26, which is referenced in verse 10 of Galatians 3. He's wanting to connect that with the curse that he's talking about in verse 13. If not thematically, then at least maybe linguistically. There's kind of a rhetorical style that's going on here. So we might also try to see Paul's overarching logic in this section of Galatians. Scholars note that Paul seems to be responding to an objector. In Galatians, he is refuting somebody who is spreading false teaching, and this passage of Deuteronomy 27:26 is probably the very verse, or at least one of the verses that the false teachers are using. And as I noted from Jerome, it may be that even this earlier people were objecting to Christ from Deuteronomy 21:23. That seems to, at least Jerome comments that this is some type of long-standing objection using the idea of Deuteronomy 21:23. So it may be that Paul is employing these verses and in a sense trying to take them back and use them against the false teacher. So that's something to keep in mind here. Now, I think that Lewis Martin is going along the right track here when he comments in the Anchor Yale Bible commentary of this verse. As we have noted, the teachers will have cited Deuteronomy 27:26 as a threat to their Gentile hearers. If you do not observe the law, you stand under its curses. Paul accepts the text as it stands, that is, as a reference to those who are not observant, but by referring in his exegesis to those who are observant, Paul removes the distinction between the two, thus displaying an understanding of the law's curse that is worlds away from that of the teachers. In a word, for Paul, the curse of the law falls on both observer and non-observer. I think Lewis is on the right track here. This seems to be the idea in Paul, that all humanity was under a curse, though I personally wouldn't say that the curse was from the law in the sense that the law caused it. It's not that God created the law and then the law did this thing to us. I'm inclined to think that the curse existed because of human sin. sin, and then the law is given as a way to deal with that curse and prevent it and its negative consequences till the time of Christ. As Paul tells us in Galatians, the law was given because of transgressions, and it served as our guardian until the time of Christ. This is why I think Paul says, hey, if you're observing the law, that means you're already under a curse. So with that as the background, I think it makes sense to say, as we all surely probably want to say, that Jesus suffered the consequences of sin on the cross. Jesus was perfect, sinless, but he nonetheless suffered and in some sense bore the curse that hung over all humanity. He experienced it for us. This curse need not be thought of as a punishment dealt out by God, but as a consequence for our sinful actions. These consequences include being slave to hostile spiritual powers and captive to the power of death. As Hebrew tells us, Jesus destroyed the one who held the powers of death. Yet I see no reason to abandon the idea that Jesus became a curse in a second sense as well. Not only did Jesus become a curse in the sense that he experienced and bore the curse that all of humanity bore, and this idea that Paul seems to be thinking of when he cites Deuteronomy 27, he also became a curse in the sense that he became something that was an affront to God. At least this is what I'm thinking here. I don't feel compelled to rule this idea out. I think Paul likely knew the complications of Deuteronomy 21:23 that I talked about towards the beginning of this video. Paul shows signs in his writing of being a very skilled exegete. And I think the Greek sources of Deuteronomy 21:23 show that Jews around this time and sometime after were struggling to make sense of what that verse in Deuteronomy meant. And it may be that Paul wanted both of these ideas to come into our mind. I'm not saying that's for sure the case. There's no way to show that for sure that that's the case, but it's just important, I think. I think it's worth considering that maybe when Paul says this, he is invoking a plethora of images or a plethora of meanings. I think this is worth poking and prodding at. One of the things that makes interpreting Paul's use of the Old Testament text complicated is that he, like other Jewish teachers, will draw on verses in ways that are not technically how they were originally intended. So, for instance, commentators have long recognized that Paul's use of Deuteronomy 27:26 and Galatians 3:10, which I mentioned earlier, that seems at first glance to actually cut against his point. It seems that original Old Testament meaning seems to point in the opposite direction of what he's citing it for, which is why we have to pay close attention to his logic. Similarly, we see in Matthew 2, we see a quote from Hosea 11 about how God called Israel out of Egypt, and that's applied to Jesus. But originally, that verse didn't have any clear messianic implications about being about Jesus. It's about something that happened in the past with Israel. So it may be that in Paul's use of these verses, he cites them not as we might cite something in a modern day as a proof text, but as a way to invoke the ideas or the language or, to connect dots, so to speak. And so it may be important to keep that in mind, especially given that Paul is, refuting some type of objector in this letter. So anywho, where does that leave us with Jesus being cursed? Well, here are my really tentative conclusions. Did Jesus become a curse in the sense that he was cursed by God? No. Paul seems to intentionally avoid that insinuation with his citation of Deuteronomy 21:23 by removing of God from that. And that could have potentially been playing into the hands of the objectors he was addressing in Galatians if he had said that. Additionally, early Christian writers such as Justin Martyr seem to deny this idea. They seem to want to reject that. And also, as I noted, Jerome also seems motivated to reject it. So, did Jesus become a curse in the sense that he suffered from the curse that hung over humanity? Yes, that seems to fit well with what Paul says and also with other scriptures in the New Testament as well. Now, did Jesus become a curse in the sense that on the cross he was an affront to God? Did Jesus become a curse in the sense that he became something that when God looked at it, it is something that it was almost like an affront to him, an insult to him? And that's the idea we talked about with Deuteronomy 21:23 earlier. On this, I'm going to say maybe, even apart from the language of Deuteronomy 21:23, even apart from whether or not that's something that's intended by Paul, which there's really no clear indications either way that he was intending that or wasn't. Even apart from Paul's use of Deuteronomy 21:23, it seems likely that just the fact of Jesus hanging on the cross would be something that is in some sense offensive to God. So some of you might be thinking, wow, James, this was a whole lot of talking just to get to a relatively mellow anticlimactic conclusion. And to that I say, yeah. Welcome to Biblical Studies. Let me know what you think in the comments, and consider checking out my book, The Devil's Disbarment, where I explain how I think Jesus saved humanity. It's probably not an explanation you've heard before, so yeah, everybody take it easy.